You are listening to Catholic Family Podcast.
Welcome back to the Catholic Family Podcast. This is William Davis, and today I want to talk about some definitions in the Catholic vocabulary. No, they are not matters of deep theological concern, nor are they really important to faith and morals, but just some interesting facts and tidbits. What I am talking about are the differences between a cathedral, a basilica, a church, and a chapel, and also the differences between the consecration and dedication of a church, and finally, the definition of privileged altars and station churches. In the church, there is a beautiful variety of vocabulary, words very descriptive and useful to know when communicating the faith. Words such as Zacchedo, Ultramontanism, and Aspergillum. You'd be forgiven for not knowing what these words mean, but you might be surprised to learn the definition of some words that you thought you knew. For example, we can call all places of worship churches, but there are in fact many distinctions between the different places of Catholic worship. A chapel is a small building for Christian worship, typically one attached to an institution or private house. So a chapel is not usually a church in and of itself, but is inside a larger building or even as a side altar inside a much larger church. If a chapel is a building all to itself, it is small and cannot hold a large number of people. A church is larger than a chapel and is a building all of itself. A church has to have an altar specifically, while a chapel does not require an altar. Basilicas and cathedrals are technically churches, but they are much larger and have special properties about them that make them uniquely classified. An abbey is a monastery, which is a church of monks, that is ruled over by an abbot who is usually part of a religious order and not under the local bishop. An abbey is almost like a cathedral in that the abbot resides within the abbey and directs other monasteries from there. A cathedral can only be so if it is the headquarters of the diocesan bishop. Cathedrals are almost always very large buildings and are most often located in large cities. The word cathedral comes from the Latin word cathedra, which means throne. So a large church can't be a cathedral if the bishop does not reside there. Some of the most famous cathedrals are the old Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, before it was tragically, and possibly intentionally, severely damaged, the Cologne Cathedral in Germany, the Florence Cathedral in Italy, the St. Patrick's in New York, and my personal favorite, St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, also in Italy, and many, many others. In medieval times, and still in some cities today, a cathedral would be the largest and most impressive building in a city. And now, what about basilicas? Basilicas, from the Latin word for palace, can be very confusing, but I'll try to define them as best as I can. Basilicas differ from cathedrals in that their antiquity or role in important historical events give them certain privileges. These being that they have a high main altar that can be reserved to the Pope or cardinals, and also Rome can claim a higher jurisdiction over a basilica than the local bishop does. In Rome, some basilicas are so named because that is what they were called at the time they were built in the Roman era, before being converted into a church. These architectural basilicas were built on a rectangular base and was split into aisles by columns and covered by a roof. Later on, some of these buildings were called basilicas because they were built closely resembling an ancient Roman basilica. This type of architectural basilica does not have the canonical status of a true basilica, and so are not included in lists of basilicas, even though they are still called basilicas. All this can lead to some confusion, but it's only about to get better. There are also some basilicas that have been revered as such since time immemorial, making them not quite major basilicas and not quite minor basilicas either. These old canonical basilicas include the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Church of the Agony in Jerusalem, and several others, mostly in Jerusalem. There are also the 4 major basilicas in Rome, the most important churches in the world, which have special blessings that make them canonically higher than your average basilica. And finally, there are the minor basilicas, which constitute the vast majority of basilicas today. Minor basilicas are a relatively recent thing in the Church, the first one being consecrated in 1873 in Tolentino, Italy. But since then there have been more than 1,800 basilicas consecrated, although a very large number of these were created by the Novus Ordo. but I found it exceedingly difficult to sift through them all to determine the exact numbers. I hope that I explained the somewhat convoluted facts about basilicas sufficiently and not too confusingly. Now, with all that done and said, on to another matter. I have mentioned several times now about churches being consecrated, but churches can also be dedicated or blessed. According to the Council of Trent and the Congregation of Rites, the Mass should not be celebrated in any place except a consecrated or blessed church. Hence, it is the wish of the Church that at least cathedrals and parish churches should be solemnly consecrated, and that smaller churches be blessed. But any church or public or semi-public oratory may be consecrated. Both by consecration and by blessing, a church is dedicated to divine worship, which forbids its use for common or profane purposes. Consecration is a rite reserved to a bishop, who by the solemn anointing with holy chrism, and in the prescribed form, dedicates a building to the service of God, thereby raising it in perpetuum to a higher order, removing it from the malign influence of Satan, and rendering it a place in which the prayers of the faithful are more readily heard and favors are more graciously granted by God. The blessing of a church is a less solemn rite, which may be performed by a priest delegated by the diocesan bishop. It consists in the sprinkling with holy water and the recital of prayers, thus making it a sacred place, though not necessarily in perpetuum. Consecration differs from mere blessing in this, that it imprints an indelible mark on the building, by reason of which it may never be transferred to common or profane uses. As a side note, churches that have been consecrated, since they cannot be used for any other purpose, must be torn down if it can no longer be used for worship. But a blessed church can be repurposed, however. The next thing I want to address is a privileged altar, and it is really quite simple. A privileged altar is an altar where, when Mass is said on it, a plenary indulgence can be gained on behalf of a soul in purgatory. By the 1900s, bishops could designate churches in their dioceses to contain a privileged altar, whereas previously only the Pope could give such designations. Also, and I found this interesting, priests who have taken the heroic act of charity, which is basically giving all the propitiatory graces they gain to the souls in purgatory, among other things, gives them the honor of gaining a plenary indulgence for a soul in purgatory wherever they celebrate Mass. So these priests pretty much have their own personal privileged altar every time they offer Mass. Now, moving on to the final thing. A station church is a church where the Pope has Mass in Rome on certain days of the year. On major feasts and throughout Lent and Paschaltide, it used to be the custom for the Pope to have Mass in the different churches in the Holy See, so as to strengthen the sense of community in Rome. Certain privileges were attached to being present on the appointed day in the appointed station church when the Pope celebrated Mass. And to give an example, Thursday of the fourth week in Lent, the station is at the Church of St. Sylvester and Martin, and for being present at this Mass you can gain, under the usual conditions, an indulgence of 10 years and 10 quarantines, which is a period of 40 days and has nothing to do with COVID. That just about covers everything I promised I would cover. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, or ideas for future podcasts, please inform us in the comments. Thank you for listening to the Catholic Family Podcast. God bless you.